The lake lay still, birds chirping in the distance, as my wife Sandra was about to drop a marshmallow into her hot cocoa. That's when 4 squad cars rolled up to our cabin, lights flashing red and blue across the water. Though the sirens were off, the air was thick with tension. The officers advanced, hands hovering near their holsters, while a shrill voice broke the quiet. "There she is. That's the woman who thinks the rules don't apply to her. Arrest her." It was Karen. Karen, the president of our HOA, clad in her floral dress and pearls, her hand shaking as she pointed at my wife like she'd just spotted a fugitive. She ignored the fine. She broke the rules. "I warned you, officer." She believes she can push the HOA around, but not today. Today she's going to jail. One of the younger officers looked puzzled. "And what's the charge, exactly, ma'am?" Karen's voice cracked with frustration. She painted her dock eggshell white instead of Lakewood beige. "It's a clear violation, and she hasn't paid the fine I issued." I glanced over at Sandra, calm as ever. She hadn't said a single word. She rose from her seat, brushed her hands on a napkin, and reached into her cardigan pocket, pulling out her federal badge. The young officer's eyes widened. "The broken bar Judge Sandra Miller," as in the federal judge Sandra Miller. The whole moment seemed to pause. Even the breeze off the lake stopped for a beat. Karen's expression shifted from fury to bewilderment. "What number? That can't be real. That's fake." Sandra finally spoke, her voice steady and clear. "I suggest you step back, ma'am. You're dangerously close to turning this into something very serious." The officer dropped his hand away from his holster. "Ma'am, she's a sitting federal judge." Karen's jaw dropped open, but the damage had already been done, because Sandra wasn't just any federal judge. She was the very woman Karen had been tormenting for months. And now everything had come full circle. But how did it escalate to this point? How did my wife, one of the most respected judges in the country, end up facing off with the HOA president over something as small as a cabin fine? Allow me to go back. I'm Marcus Miller, a retired high school principal. After 40 years of work, my wife Sandra and I chose to retire in Lakewood Pines. We had raised 2 daughters, paid off our city home, and finally found this serene lake cabin to enjoy our golden years. Lakewood Pines looked like paradise in the brochures: peaceful trails, good fishing spots, friendly neighbors. What the brochures left out, however, was the homeowners association, and more specifically, the woman at the helm, Karen Whitmore. For over a decade, Karen ruled the HOA like it was her personal empire. She had a clipboard ready for every neighbor, a measuring tape in her SUV, and a personality so overbearing you'd want to draw the curtains just hearing her shoes on the walkway. The trouble began almost the moment we arrived. We were still unpacking boxes when Karen marched up to our porch. "Just so you know, I enforce the rules strictly around here. We've had issues with outsiders bringing in bad habits from the city. I trust you won't be doing that." Sandra, composed as always, smiled politely. "Thank you for letting us know. We've reviewed the community guidelines. We'll be fine." Karen narrowed her eyes. "I hope so." At first, it was minor nuisances. A warning letter when our trash cans weren't brought in by exactly 10:01 a.m. A citation on our door because our mailbox flag wasn't the approved shade of red. Then came the bigger issue, the dock. The paint had started peeling badly, and Sandra, who likes things neat, decided to give it a fresh coat. She picked a gentle eggshell white, a classic, calming color. 2 days later, we found a $500 fine taped to our mailbox. "Unauthorized paint color on dock." Sandra didn't flinch. She folded the paper, put it away in her drawer, and carried on as if nothing had happened. Her quiet resolve should have been warning enough, but Karen didn't see it that way. To Karen, Sandra's silence was an insult, a dare. She doubled the fine the following week. When Sandra didn't respond, Karen stormed over with 2 HOA board members in tow. "This is your final notice," Karen announced, pleased with herself. "Either repaint your dock to the approved color or pay the fine." Sandra met her gaze without blinking. "You have no authority to impose fines not approved by the community board, and nowhere in the bylaws is there a rule about this specific paint color." Karen bristled. "I am the board." Sandra simply closed the door. That's when Karen's campaign truly began. She called animal control, claiming we had raccoons. She reported us to the county for illegal construction when we replaced a broken gutter. She even filed noise complaints when we played soft jazz in the afternoon. Through all of it, Sandra stayed silent. She never raised her voice, never took the bait. But I knew she was waiting. Sandra doesn't fight battles in anger. She lets the law speak for her. And Karen had just handed her everything she needed. One night, as Sandra sat on the porch, sipping chamomile tea with the moonlight glinting off the water, I asked her, "How long are you going to let this go on?" She smiled, just faintly. Before answering a broken bar, Karen finally showed how far she'd go when she crossed a line Sandra couldn't ignore. It happened when Karen forged a fake violation notice and threatened to put a lien on our cabin. Sandra didn't react outwardly, but that very night, she made 3 quiet phone calls, one to the county clerk, another to her legal aide back in the city, and the third to a colleague on the federal ethics board. When I asked her what she had in mind, she only said 2 words: due process. Karen had no idea what was coming, and so he ended up here, officers at our doorstep, Karen seething with righteous anger, and my wife calmly holding out her badge. The younger officer turned to Karen. "Ma'am, filing a false report is a serious matter. You could face legal consequences." Karen stumbled back, her voice suddenly cracking. "No, I didn't know who she really was. I wasn't trying to cause trouble." But then the officer's radio crackled to life. "Dispatch to Unit 4. Can you confirm you're at the Lakewood Pines address? We have a report from the U.S. Marshals about a possible impersonation and harassment claim involving Judge Sandra Miller." Everyone went still. Karen's eyes darted from Sandra to me, her face pale. Is this some kind of setup?" she whispered. Sandra didn't say a word. Karen reached into her purse, maybe for her phone, but the officer held up a hand. "Ma'am, please keep your hands where we can see them." In that moment, with siren lights flickering across the water and neighbors peeking out from behind trees, Karen's composure finally shattered. But that wasn't the end. What Karen didn't know was that Sandra had kept meticulous records of every warning, every threat, every absurd fine, and by calling the police on a sitting federal judge over a paint color, Karen had stepped into a legal disaster of her own making. Sandra was ready to let the facts speak for themselves. But then something unexpected happened. Karen's knees buckled, and she fainted right there on our porch, collapsing in a heap. Sandra didn't panic. She knelt down beside her, calm as ever. "Call for an ambulance," she told the officer. "And don't touch her. She has a heart condition. It's listed in her home medical file." The officer looked at her, surprised. "How do you know that?" Sandra kept her gaze steady. "Because she submitted that paperwork when she tried to get out of jury duty in my courtroom last year." Paramedics arrived quickly. Karen lay still on the porch, her pearls clicking softly against the wood as they checked her pulse and breathing. I stood back, watching as the officers spoke quietly among themselves, and neighbors watched silently from their windows and porches. The paramedics soon stood and said, "She's stable, likely just fainted. We'll take her to the hospital to make sure she's okay." Before leaving, the lead officer, a tall man named Officer Brooks, turned back to Sandra. "Apologies for the confusion, Judge Miller. We thought this was only a civil HOA complaint." Sandra nodded slightly. "I understand, but this isn't just a civil matter anymore." Miss Whitmore's actions went far beyond that. "You'll be hearing from my office." As they wheeled Karen away, I noticed the way the neighbors reacted, some half hiding behind curtains, others standing on porches, pretending to fuss with plants that didn't need watering. No one said a word, but the silence spoke volumes. They'd all seen what Karen had turned into, and none of them had dared challenge her until now. When the commotion finally faded, Sandra and I went back inside. I poured us both some sweet tea, and we sat quietly by the window, looking out at the calm water. "Are you really going to go through with this?" I asked. Sandra didn't hesitate. "Absolutely. Not because of what she did to me, but because people like her think they can intimidate anyone they want without consequence. That has to end." I nodded. "Then I'm with you. Whatever you need." For the next few days, the lake was unusually quiet. No Karen, no meetings, no sudden HOA emails. But both of us knew it wouldn't stay quiet for long. Sandra had been busy behind the scenes. She gathered every letter Karen had ever sent us, saved every voicemail, and printed every email where Karen made threats or imposed fines without proper authority. Then Sandra discovered something even bigger. Karen hadn't been lawfully elected as HOA president in years. Instead, she'd postponed the required elections 3 years in a row, claiming emergency measures left over from the pandemic. The bylaws, however, clearly required a vote every 12 months. Sandra dug deeper. She found overcharged invoices for landscaping that didn't match the actual work, receipts for equipment the HOA never received, and contracts with Karen's cousin's business charging double the normal rate. It went beyond petty finesse. It looked a lot like fraud. That's when Sandra decided to act. Using the very bylaws Karen always quoted, she filed for an emergency HOA board meeting. A broken bar. The bylaws allowed any homeowner to call a special meeting if they gathered signatures from at least 20% of the neighborhood. Sandra didn't just meet that number, she surpassed it, collecting 37 signatures in just 2 days. At first, some neighbors hesitated, but once they saw the documents she uncovered, once they realized where their dues had really been going, fear turned into resolve. The meeting was scheduled for Friday night. By then, Karen had returned from the hospital. She looked paler, a little worn down, but she hadn't lost that edge. When she found the notice taped to her door, she stormed down to our cabin and slammed her fist against the glass. "I know this is your doing," she screamed. I opened the door calmly. "It isn't just us, Karen. It's the community. It's called democracy." She trembled with anger. "You think you are clever? Think your little legal maneuvers can take me down?" Behind me, Sandra stepped forward, holding a folder thick with evidence. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. But before Sandra could say a word, Karen's eyes rolled back, and she collapsed to the ground. Sandra rushed to her side, kneeling as a few neighbors gasped and stepped closer. I pushed through, my pulse racing. "Sandra, what's happening?" Sandra checked Karen's pulse, then looked up at me, her expression tight with concern. "She's not breathing. Call 911. Her voice cut through the confusion like a blade. In an instant, the room erupted, chairs scraping, people shouting, some frozen in place, unsure what to do. I called emergency services, my hands shaking. Sandra stayed composed, counting out loud as she began chest compressions right there on the community hall floor. 30 compressions, 2 rescue breaths, again and again. "Stay with me, Karen," she murmured, pressing down rhythmically. I knelt beside them, holding Karen's wrist, praying for any sign of life. Sandra didn't waver, her focus absolute, like she'd stepped into a courtroom and nothing else existed. The paramedics arrived within minutes. They slipped through the stunned crowd, took over, and carefully lifted Karen onto a stretcher. One medic glanced at Sandra. "You kept her going long enough," he said. "That probably saved her life." Karen's chest rose faintly as they wheeled her out, her face ghostly pale. The room fell silent, and not out of fear for Karen, but because of what they had witnessed. The woman who had tormented them for years had just been saved by the very neighbor she tried to crush. Sandra stood, brushed off her knees, and looked out over the assembled crowd. "Everyone deserves dignity," she said quietly, "even if they never give it." No one clapped, no one cheered, but the silence felt heavier than any applause. That night, back at the cabin, we sat on the porch in quiet reflection. The lake was calm. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. A single loon called across the water. "You saved her life," I finally said. Sandra didn't answer right away. Then she turned to me. "I did what anyone should do." "You didn't have to," I said softly. "Not after everything she did to us." Sandra looked back at the sky. "No, I didn't." "But that's what makes the difference." The next morning, our whole group chat lit up. Karen was stable at the hospital, and the community was buzzing. People finally spoke out. Sandra did what Karen never would have. If that's not leadership, I don't know what is. She should be president. That last thought spread quickly. The emergency audit was still set for Monday, but now the real questions emerged. Who really ran the HOA? How did things get so toxic? And most importantly, who should lead it next? Sandra wanted no part of it. She hadn't moved here to rule over anyone. Titles meant nothing to her. But the neighbors had seen something they couldn't unsee. Strength paired with compassion. And once people witness that, they remember. Over the next few days, Karen stayed in the hospital. We heard it had been a mild heart attack, enough to force her into silence, at least for now. Then came the letters. Not from lawyers, but from neighbors. Notes slipped into our mailbox. One arrived with a plate of cookies, another with a small bouquet of yellow tulips. All shared the same message in different words. Thank you. One evening, Mrs. Callahan, the same woman Karen had fined for a garden nominee, knocked on our door. Her eyes were damp as she spoke. I've lived here 20 years, she whispered. I never thought anyone would stand up to her, and then you saved her, too. You reminded me good people still exist. Sandra offered a gentle smile. Thank you, that means a lot, but not everyone was so grateful. 2 days later, Karen's son appeared. Mitchell Whitmore, a slick man in his 30s, dressed in polished loafers, moving like the world belonged to him, stormed up our porch without so much as a knock. I hope you're satisfied, he shouted. My mother's in the hospital because of you people. Before Sandra could step forward, I did. You people? I said evenly. You mean the neighbors she threatened and bullied for years? Mitchell jabbed a finger at my chest. You don't know what it's you have no idea what it's like to be her son, Mitchell snapped. She gave everything to this community. All she ever wanted was order. Sandra stepped out onto the porch, arms folded across her chest. Order isn't the same as power, Mr. Whitmore. And what your mother's done isn't leadership, it's control. His glare hardened. You think you are better than her? No, Sandra replied, her voice steady and cool. But I know the law, and I know this community deserves better. Mitchell's jaw tightened. He spun on his heel and stormed off the porch, but halfway to his car he turned back, eyes blazing. You really think this is over? You have no idea what my mother's capable of. He slammed the door of his sleek black Mercedes and roared off down the graveled drive. Sandra let out a slow breath. Well, that was dramatic, she muttered. But a chill settled in my chest. Something in his voice sounded less like a threat and more like a promise. And the proof arrived the very next day. A certified envelope landed in our mailbox. No return address. Inside, a new fine from Karen. Unauthorized public use of HOA documents. The amount, $2,000. Even from her hospital bed, she was still fighting, still trying to keep her grip on the neighborhood. But that wasn't the worst part. Attached to the fine was a document, an emergency HOA board vote, supposedly conducted by email, reinstating Karen as president by unanimous decision. Only problem? No one we spoke to had received a ballot. No vote had ever happened. From her hospital bed, Karen was forging votes and falsifying official records. It was reckless. It was desperate. And it was criminal. Sandra held the papers for a long moment, then handed them to me, her eyes clear and cold. Now it's time to go to court. But just as she was about to file the official complaint, there was a knock at the door. It wasn't a neighbor. And it wasn't Karen. On our porch stood a man in a gray suit, a government badge clipped to his pocket. Mrs. Miller, he said, his tone calm but firm, we need to talk. It's about Miss Whitmore's activities with the HOA and a possible criminal case. Sandra didn't flinch. Come in, she said. He introduced himself as Agent Donnelly from the Office of the Inspector General. Everything about him was careful and deliberate. The kind of measured calm that made it clear he already knew plenty. We received an anonymous tip about questionable operations here in Lakewood Pines, he explained, setting a leather folder on our coffee table. We've traced several financial irregularities back to Ms. Whitmore. Then he held up the forged vote document we'd just received. With this, things have escalated. Sandra didn't even blink. How serious is it? He met her gaze. Serious enough for the state's attorney to open a preliminary investigation. Mail fraud, misuse of community funds, possibly even elder coercion. I swallowed. Are you saying Karen might actually go to jail? Agent Donnelly nodded. If the evidence holds up, yes. It looks like she's been running this whole like her own private kingdom and siphoning off thousands in the process. Sandra got up, crossed the room, and came back with a folder of evidence we'd gathered over weeks. Voicemails, emails, photos of the dock renovations Karen had approved without permits, and an invoice to her cousin's landscaping company that didn't even exist on the contractor registry. Donnelly's eyebrows rose as he flipped through the papers. This is strong, he said quietly. If you're willing to give a sworn statement, Judge Miller, It could seal the case. Sandra didn't hesitate. Schedule it. He closed the folder, stood, and shook our hands. Thank you both. I'll be in touch. When the door closed behind him, I turned to her. Do you realize what's happening? You're not just exposing Karen anymore. You're tearing down everything she built. Sandra looked out at the lake, the water reflecting the late afternoon sun. I'm not doing this to destroy her, she said softly. I'm doing it so no one else has to live under her fear. People like Karen see kindness as weakness, but it isn't. It's a choice. And there are some lines you don't cross. I watched her in that moment, quiet, steady, unshakably, and felt a respect that was deeper than words. But Karen wasn't finished. Not yet. The very next morning, as I went out to get the paper, I saw something strange on the dock. A bouquet of lilies tied with a ribbon, and a single card tucked inside. Let's not destroy each other. Let's talk one last time. AK. I held it in my hands for a while, unsure if it was a peace offering or bait. When I showed it to Sandra, she just raised an eyebrow. She wants a private meeting, Sandra said quietly. She wants to regain control of the story. She isn't sorry, she's scared. Still, I could see the hesitation in Sandra's eyes, the part of her that had spent years listening to both sides before passing judgment. She finally agreed. They'd meet on the community dock, a neutral ground. I insisted on coming too, waiting nearby, just in case. When we arrived, Karen was already there. She looked older, frailer, the hospital stay carved into the lines of her face. But her eyes still burned with something fierce and unyielding. Karen looked older, her cheeks sunken, but her eyes still burned with that cold, calculating glint. A silk scarf hid the edge of a hospital bruise, and she leaned on a cane, but the string of pearls was there, as always. Sandra stepped forward, hands tucked in her coat pockets. Karen spoke first. I don't want this to get worse. Sandra tilted her head. Worse? You forged votes, harassed families, lied to the board, and now you're under criminal investigation. Karen's face twitched. This neighborhood needs structure. They're lazy, Sandra. People don't want responsibility, they want someone to do the hard parts for them. Your job wasn't to control them, Sandra said, voice calm and even. It was to represent them. Karen's voice cracked, her knuckles white on the cane. You don't understand. You're a judge. You live in rules and facts. I live in a place where if I don't hold the line, everything falls apart. Sandra nodded slowly. So you lied to keep your fantasy alive. Karen's hands trembled. I built this place before you, before them, and I won't watch it all get torn down. From a bench nearby, my heart pounded. That's when Karen made her move. She raised a phone and started recording. You heard her, right? She called out to no one, threatening me, harassing an elderly woman with heart trouble trying to steal control of the HOA. Sandra stayed perfectly still, then reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small digital recorder. Already recording, she said, her voice flat as stone. I've recorded every conversation for the past 2 weeks, including the ones where you forged votes and admitted to financial fraud. Karen's hand froze in midair. Sandra stepped closer, her words low and final. I'm not here to argue anymore. I'm here to tell you, you're done. Step down voluntarily, or the court will remove you. You have until the audit starts Monday morning. Karen's mouth opened, then closed. She didn't scream, didn't plead. She just sat down slowly on the dock bench, staring out at the water. I was only trying to make things better, she whispered. Sandra's gaze softened, but only for a moment. So were the people you bullied, she said quietly. We turned and walked away, the air between them heavy as stone. It felt final, but it wasn't, because 2 nights later, after midnight, a storm had just passed when loud banging shook our door at 2:43 a.m. I scrambled out of bed and opened it. Officer Brooks stood on the porch, breathless, 2 patrol cars idling behind him, their red lights flashing against a wet pavement. Marcus, he panted, I need you to come with me. My chest tightened. What happened? Brooks glanced past me, at Sandra now standing behind. There's been a fire, he said. A big one, at the HOA office. And your names were found spray-painted on the wall. By the time we got there, the flames were mostly out. Smoke curled into the night sky from what was left of the small brick office by the lake, now a blackened shell. The wooden awning had collapsed, the windows were shattered, and the HOA's official sign clung to a bent nail, half melted. But the worst part was the message, painted in angry red letters before the wall crumbled. Judge Sandra, burn. I felt my blood run cold. Sandra didn't speak, neither did Brooks. A few neighbors stood behind yellow tape and pajamas, whispering, faces pale. One of the fire investigators approached Brooks and spoke quietly, but I heard every word. Accelerant used, he said. Likely gasoline. This wasn't an accident. Brooks turned to us, regret in his eyes. I'm sorry, but we'll need to ask some questions. Sandra's voice was calm, but her eyes were steely. You think someone wanted to scare us? Brooks hesitated. I think someone wanted to send a message. And we all knew who Sandra was thinking of, Karen. But could she have really done this? Was she even out of the hospital? Brooks asked to see our security camera footage. Months ago, Sandra had installed motion-activated cameras pointed at the common areas just in case. While I stayed back to help with the footage, Sandra gave a statement. The video was grainy but clear enough. At 1:14 a.m., a hooded figure carrying 2 red gas cans appeared at the office door. They moved fast, splashing liquid around, then lit a fire. They sprayed the threat on the wall, then vanished into the trees. No visible face, no license plate, but something about the figure, tall, lean, quick, stood out. Sandra watched the footage silently, then spoke. That's not Karen. She was right. The person moved like someone younger, with a sure, athletic stride Karen hadn't had in years. We played it again, frame by frame, and that's when I noticed something else. The figure on the video had a limp, favoring their left side. My stomach dropped. Mitchell, Karen's son. When he stormed off our porch weeks ago, I'd noticed him walking stiffly, like he had an old injury. Could he have disguised himself? Or worse, could Karen have asked him to do it for her? Brooks collected the footage and filed it away. We'll escalate this, he said grimly. Now it's arson and a threat against a federal official. That night, back at the cabin, sleep wouldn't come in, not from fear, but anger. They think fire and paint will stop you, I said, pacing the floor, rage buzzing under my skin. Sandra sat unmoving, her gaze fixed beyond the glass windows at the dark, rippling lake. They think I'm alone. I stopped. She turned to me, her voice steady. But I'm not. At dawn, we started making calls to every neighbor who'd signed Sandra's emergency petition, who'd brought pies, shared stories, cried on our porch. We told them everything. The fire, the threat, the footage. By noon, our front lawn overflowed. More than 30 residents came with folding chairs, thermoses of coffee, and handwritten signs. Mr. Flanagan from 3 houses down brought a megaphone. If she won't step down, we'll vote her down, he declared. Mrs. Callahan brought a fresh petition, this one demanding Karen's immediate removal and an extension of the audit. They were done being quiet, done being intimidated. Then, the Lakewood Pines Facebook group lit up. We stand with Judge Sandra Miller. We stand against fear. The post spread fast, first across town, then picked up by local reporters. By afternoon, state news stations were calling. For the first time, it felt like we weren't fighting this alone. But momentum has a way of turning. Later that day, a black SUV rolled up to our cabin. 2 federal marshals stepped out. Judge Miller? One said, tipping his hat. We need you to come with us. Sandra blinked. What's this about? The second marshal handed her a folder. Inside, a formal complaint accusing her of intimidation, wire fraud, and misuse of public office for personal retaliation. My mouth fell open. That's insane. Who filed this? The marshal's face didn't change. Karen Whitmore. Sandra stood very still. I leaned in, my voice low. They're using your badge against you. They didn't cuff her, but they asked her to ride with them downtown to clarify some concerns. As Sandra turned toward the car, she caught my eye. Call Agent Donnelly. Now, I nodded, hard hammering, because this wasn't a neighborhood feud anymore. Karen had just fired her boldest shot as she was trying to get my wife disbarred. Downtown, the federal building was glass and concrete, cold and silent. I stood outside, phone in hand, counting every minute Sandra was inside. I called Agent Donnelly. His voice was clipped, sharp. They blindsided us, he said. The complaint was filed under confidential whistleblower protection. She'll be cleared, but it has to go through process. An hour later, he called again, angrier this time. I just got word. Karen's attorney is pushing for Sandra's suspension from the bench until this is resolved. My fist clenched. How is that even possible? The woman terrorizing the neighborhood gets to flip the story and play victim. They're not trying to win. Donnelly replied. They're trying to destroy her reputation and make her look guilty before the real hearing even begins. I stared at the building and whispered, she's stronger than they think. Inside, Sandra sat across from two federal interviewers, hands folded, voice calm. You've served on the bench how long? One agent asked. 23 years, Sandra answered. And in that time, have you ever faced an ethics complaint? Not once. The agent's brow furrowed. Yet Miss Whitmore alleges you used your position to incite public unrest to orchestrate a personal vendetta. Sandra raised an eyebrow. My husband and I moved to Lakewood Pines for retirement. I didn't even know Karen Whitmore until she handed me my first HOA citation. Her harassment began before she ever knew I was a judge. The lead agent flipped through the file. You didn't report the initial fines or conflicts. I tried to de-escalate. She escalated. And the arson. I've cooperated fully. The attack endangered my family and neighbors. I never used my judicial authority outside the law. The second agent leaned in. Yet you filed for a federal audit. That's not a small step. Sandra's voice didn't waver. When I discovered evidence of financial fraud, I did what any citizen should do. I reported it. The room fell quiet. Finally, the first agent spoke, his tone softer. Off the record, Judge Milra Brokenbar, do you think Karen Whitmore is dangerous? Sandra didn't blink. I think she's terrified of losing power, Sandra said quietly, of being exposed. And yes, Brokenbar scared people make dangerous choices. An hour later, she stepped out of the federal building. Her face was calm, composed, but her eyes were harder, sharper than before. They're letting me go home, she said, sliding into the passenger seat. But they've placed me under temporary review. I can't hear cases until the complaint is resolved. My chest ached. I'm so sorry, Sandy. She met my eyes. No, she said, she will be sorry. That night, when we returned to Lakewood Pines, my heart stopped. Red spray paint slashed across the walls. Get out. Abuse of power. Judge. Windows shattered. Trash strewn across our porch. Sandra walked forward slowly, breathing deep. She didn't flinch, didn't cry. Instead, she whispered, this is her last card. We called the police. Officer Brooks came again, this time with his partner, Thompson, a stern woman with tired eyes. They documented everything, took photos, filed another report. This is targeted harassment, Thompson muttered, crouching by the broken planter. And I doubt your HOA president just happened to be somewhere else when it happened. Sandra nodded. We know who did it. We just can't prove it yet. Brooks shook his head. Not for long. We've been monitoring traffic around your house. If someone came through last night, we'll catch them. 2 hours later, my phone buzzed. Brooks, you're going to want to see this. He'd sent footage from the mailbox camera, the same camera Karen herself insisted on installing months ago. At 1:06 a.m., a car pulled up, its license plate partially covered. Out stepped a tall woman in dark clothes, walking stiffly, favoring one leg. She tossed eggs, sprayed the walls, dumped trash. Then, for a moment, she turned just enough that the camera caught the glint of a gold bracelet on her wrist. I froze the frame and showed Sandra. She exhaled. Mitchell's wife, she whispered. Denise, Karen's daughter-in-law. She'd barely spoken to us since we moved in, but now she was helping her mother-in-law retaliate. This wasn't just Karen clinging to power anymore. It was an organized family effort to silence Sandra. I called Agent Donnelly immediately. We've got the link, he said. Karen orchestrated this, but now we have a trail. Sandra didn't wait. That night, she sat at her desk and wrote a statement. Short, clear, defiant. Then she posted Ida along with the footage to the Lakewood Pines HOA Facebook group. No one should feel unsafe in their home. I've served this country as a judge with integrity for over 20 years. I have never abused power and I won't be silenced by it. The truth will win. Sandra Miller. The comments flooded in. Hundreds of neighbors supporting her. Dozens sharing their own stories of HOA threats and bullying. For a moment, the tide felt like it was turning again. Then, the next morning, as we sat down for breakfast, A knock at the door. A man in a suit handed Sandra an envelope. It was from Karen's attorney. Inside, an offer. Karen would resign from the HOA presidency but only if Sandra withdrew her evidence and dropped all complaints. Sandra read it twice, then looked up, eyes cold. She thinks she's bargaining, she said, but what she doesn't realize is I've already filed everything with the state prosecutor. Just then, her phone buzzed. Caller ID, Agent Donnelly. She answered, listened, her expression shifting from calm to fierce. When she hung up, I asked, what happened? They've issued a warrant, she said. Her voice was steady. For Karen. And Mitchell too. By noon, the news spread like wildfire across Lakewood Pines. Warrants issued for Karen Whitmore and her son Mitchell Whitmore. The charges: HOA financial fraud, falsifying board records, conspiracy to harass a federal officer, and obstruction of justice. I stood beside Sandra on our porch as two unmarked black vehicles rolled down our quiet gravel road at the same road Karen once patrolled with her clipboard and measuring tape, like she ruled it. But this time, she wasn't knocking on anyone's door. This time, justice was coming to hers. The marshals walked steadily toward her house. Behind curtains, neighbors pretended not to watch her, but everyone was watching, including us. My heart pounded, not from fear, but from relief. Sandra had endured months of threats, harassment, humiliation, and loss. Now, at last, the scales were tipping. Mitchell answered the door first, dressed like a man late for court. When he saw the badges, he gave a humorless laugh. You've got to be kidding. No, sir, one of the marshals replied calmly. You're being taken in for questioning. Please step outside. What's the charge? Mitchell sneered, voice brittle. Let's not play games. The agent said. You've been warned. From inside, we heard Karen's voice crack, sharp with panic. Tell them they're wrong, Mitchell. Tell them she forged our documents. But Mitchell didn't answer. Instead, he stepped out slowly, jaw clenched, eyes lowered. Then they brought Karen out, wrapped in a silk shawl, pearls perfectly in place, but the arrogance was gone. She didn't scream, didn't faint, didn't plead. She didn't even look at the neighbors, phones out, mouths open. But when her gaze met Sandra's standing tall on our porch, arms folded, eyes unwavering as she froze. No rage, no bravado, just the truth, heavy between them. As the marshals loaded Karen and Mitchell into separate vehicles, I heard Mrs. Callahan, standing next door, whisper, almost to herself, "My God, it's actually happening." The cars pulled away. The gravel settled. For the first time in months, Lakewood Pines felt a broken bar still. That evening, a town hall was held. Not by Karen, not by fear, but by the neighbors themselves. At the lakeside pavilion, under string lights and folding chairs, people stood up, one by one, not to talk about revenge, but about rebuilding. Karen ruled by fear, one man said. Sandra brought hope. Another added, it's time we rewrite the HOA charter together. Then Mrs. Callahan roused, her voice shaking. She saved that woman's life. Then she saved all of ours. And when she could have walked away, she stayed and fought. The crowd turned to Sandra, and from the back, a voice called out, loud and sure, Sandra for HOA president. There was clapping, then cheering, then chanting. Sandra raised her hands gently, smiling. I appreciate that, truly. But I didn't come here to run anything. I came here to live in peace. If you want someone to lead, choose someone kind. Choose someone just. Choose someone who'll stay accountable. Then she sat back down beside me and sipped her tea, because that was who Sandra Miller had always been. The following week, the state's attorney confirmed it. Karen and Mitchell were formally under investigation. Sandra's name was cleared publicly. The complaint dismissed as baseless retaliation. She was reinstated immediately as a federal judge, but she didn't go back. That Friday, she sent in her retirement letter. When I asked why, she smiled softly. I've fought enough battles from behind a bench, she said. It's time to build something in front of one. And build, she did. A month later, Sandra began hosting free legal literacy workshops on our front porch. Every Saturday morning, neighbors gathered bringing coffee, questions, even their teenagers. She taught them how to read contracts, understand bylaws, and most importantly, how to stand up when something felt wrong. In the end, Karen and Mitchell took plea deals. Karen was barred from ever holding a leadership role again and fined heavily for restitution. Mitchell got a suspended sentence, but was permanently banned from handling HOA finances. Lakewood Pines elected a new board, with real votes this time. Sandra wasn't on IDA, but her presence was everywhere, in the new bylaws, the transparency, the spirit of community. And me, I finally got my wife back. No more early morning knocks, no more whispered threats, no more legal war games. Just Sandra, her tea, the calm Lakia, and the peace she'd earned the hard way. One evening, watching the sunset over the water, I turned to her. "You ever regret ignoring that fine?" I asked. Sandra laughed quietly. "No," she said. It led to the truth. As the sun dipped low, turning the lake to molten gold, she leaned against me and whispered, "Some fines cost money, but others a broken bar. They show us who people really are."